The attorney's office smelled of old coffee and copy paper, and the woman behind the desk had the particular expression of someone who had delivered difficult news so many times that the difficulty had become procedural. She had called him because the county had no one else to call. She had his name from the visiting log at Cedarwood Care Center, one of 3 names listed in the past 14 months, and the only one that wasn't a social worker or a hospice nurse. She had explained on the phone that Agnes Pruitt had passed on a Tuesday morning, that she had done so quietly and in her sleep, which the woman said with the careful warmth of someone who knew that most deaths were not quiet and wanted to give this one its due weight. What she had not explained on the phone, what she was explaining now, across the desk with a manila folder open between them, was the box. It was a shoebox. 15 inches long, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with tape that had yellowed and gone brittle at the edges. His name was written across the top in the careful cursive of a woman who had been taught handwriting when handwriting was still considered character evidence. Not his rank, not his last name, just Nathan. As if she had known, when she wrote it, exactly how much of him it needed to reach. She asked me to make sure you received it personally, the attorney said. She was very specific about that. She said you would understand what's inside. She paused. She also said, and I'm quoting directly, that you were the only one who ever asked her what she was proud of. Nathan didn't say anything. He looked at the box on the desk between them, and Ranger looked at the box too. And the room was quiet for a long moment in the way rooms go quiet when something real has just been said. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with us until the very end. What Nathan found inside that box and what it changed is something we want you to hear. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole, USMC, retired, was 39 years old and had the build of a man whose body remembered every decision it had ever been asked to make. 6 feet even, broad through the chest and shoulders, with hands that were large and capable and bore a pale rope of scar tissue across the back of the right one from a wire entanglement during a nighttime operation in Helmand Province that he didn't think about often and couldn't stop thinking about on certain kinds of nights. He had close-cropped dark hair with a thread of premature gray at the left temple that had arrived at 29 and never left. And his eyes were a deep, even brown, steady and unhurried. The kind of eyes that had looked at a sufficient number of difficult things to have developed a constitutional resistance to surprise. He had a jaw that looked like it had been designed for a specific purpose, and had fulfilled that purpose without complaint for almost 4 decades. He was not imposing in the way that announces itself. He was imposing in the way that a room realizes gradually, without being sure when it started. He had done 2 deployments with 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, Helmand in 2013, and Sangin in 2015, and had come home from the 2nd one with a Silver Star. A nerve injury in his right forearm that gave him trouble in cold weather, and the settled conviction that he had used most of the luck a man was allotted and should spend whatever remained with proportional care. The Silver Star had been for a night operation outside Sungin that he could reconstruct in precise tactical detail and had chosen not to think about in any other terms since. What he carried home was not trauma in any dramatic sense, not nightmares, not shaking. Nothing the VA intake forms had a good checkbox for. It was quieter than that. It was the particular compression of a man who had spent 12 years living at the level of complete attention and had come home to a world that did not require it, and had not yet worked out how to scale himself down without losing something essential in the calibration. He lived alone on the outskirts of Tanner, Idaho, in a house that had belonged to his father and that he had been methodically repairing for 2 years, which was also what he was doing to himself and which he did not say out loud to anyone. He did county groundskeeping work 3 days a week He went to the Cedarwood Care Center on Fridays because a VA volunteer coordinator named Phyllis had asked him 16 months ago if he had 4 hours a month to spare for the residents who didn't get visitors. And he had said yes, because he had 4 hours a month, and because Phyllis had the kind of directness he was constitutionally unable to deflect. She had a clipboard, and the expression of a woman who had heard every variation of "I'm not really a people person," and had developed a clinical immunity to it. He had gone back every Friday since, not for all the residents. For Agnes. Ranger was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, 87 pounds, with a coat the color of pale wheat along the chest and underbelly that deepened into a rich amber and black along the back and face. A coloring that in certain slants of light made him look like he was standing in a permanent autumn. His left rear leg bore a healed fracture from a building collapse in Saingen, and the leg was fully functional, but developed a slight favoring in rain that had become a reliable barometer for weather that the Idaho forecast often missed. He had a scar that bisected his left eyebrow ridge, where a fragment had passed close enough to leave its mark without doing its worst. And the scar gave him an expression of permanent, mild interest, like a professor who has heard this argument before and is already forming his response. He moved with the quiet economy of a dog who had been trained past the need to perform. No restlessness, no wasted energy, just sustained attention directed precisely where it was needed. He had been Nathan's since the adoption cleared 22 months ago. In those 22 months, Ranger had been to the Cedarwood Care Center on 31 Friday visits, and he had spent a portion of every single one of them with his chin on Agnes Pruitt's knee while she talked. And Nathan listened, and the afternoon light moved across the linoleum in the long, slow way of afternoon light in care facilities everywhere. Patient, indifferent, generous, tanner. Idaho in November was the color of pewter from the sky to the ground. The fields had given up their corn 6 weeks prior and sat stripped and silver-brown under a cloud cover that had moved in from the northwest 2 weeks ago and evidently intended to stay through spring. The air smelled of cold earth and the particular November sharpness of approaching real winter. Not yet arrived, but issuing clear notice. Nathan had driven the 22 miles from the attorney's office back to his house with the box on the passenger seat beside Ranger, who had spent the drive with his nose 1 inch from the brown paper and his ears at the particular angle that meant he was processing something that interested him, without yet having decided what it meant. Nathan had set the box on the kitchen table when they got home. He'd made coffee. He'd stood at the counter and looked at it for a while. Ranger sat beside the table with his chin resting on the tabletop and his amber eyes tracking between the box and Nathan and back to the box, conducting a patient inquiry into why the box was still closed. Agnes Pruitt had come into Nathan's Friday visits without ceremony and without strategy. She was the third resident Phyllis had introduced him to, and the introduction had been brief. "This is Agnes. She's been here 4 years. She likes to talk about the garden she used to keep." Agnes had looked at Ranger before she looked at Nathan, which Nathan had respected immediately, and she had said, "What happened to his leg?" And Nathan had told her, and she had said in the tone of a woman assigning that information to an appropriate internal file, and had begun talking about her dahlias. She was 87 years old and had been born in the house her parents built in 1937 outside Grangeville, Idaho, and had spent the first 63 years of her life within 40 miles of that house. She had married a man named Harold Pruitt in 1960, a farmer and an occasional poet, which she presented as 2 connected facts rather than 2 separate ones. Harold had died in 2001. They had 1 child, a son named Thomas, who had been killed in a highway accident in 1998 at age 36. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived her child. She had continued in the way that certain women continue, not because life had been good to her and she was grateful, but because stopping was not a thing her character would permit. She had kept the garden until she couldn't. She had kept the house until she couldn't. She had come to Cedarwood in 2020 and kept talking about the dahlias as if the garden were still hers to tend, which in the way that mattered, Nathan had come to understand. It still was. She was not a diminished person. That was the thing Nathan had understood from the second Friday, when he had stopped conducting the visit the way Phyllis had coached him. Cheerful, gentle, deferential, and had simply started talking to Agnes the way he talked to anyone who had seen things and come out the other side still standing. She had opinions on the current state of the county road repair budget, on the proper depth for dahlia tubers, on the narrative arc of a particular historical novel she had read twice and found wanting in its treatment of women's labor, and on the moral cowardice she felt was endemic to institutions that disguised their negligence as process. She was 8 years past 80, and she had not become soft or vague. She had become precise. The way old tools get precise, not despite use, but because of it. She had no family left. This was what the county had recorded, and what the staff at Cedarwood had written in the notes that passed between administrators, and what was technically accurate in the way that facts can be accurate without being the whole truth. She had no family by blood or law. What she had was a retired Marine who came on Fridays, and a German Shepherd who understood that her knee was a legitimate resting place for a large and serious head. "You're the only one who ever asked me what I was proud of," she had said to Nathan on his 4th visit. He had asked because he always asked, not as technique, not because Phyllis had told him to, but because it was the question that seemed most plainly fair. Everyone who had lived a life had done something they were proud of, and most of them had spent the last years of that life waiting for someone to inquire. Agnes had looked at him for a moment when he asked, with the expression of a woman recalibrating her estimate of a person. And then she had told him about the dahlias, dinner plate variety, burgundy and cream, that she had cultivated for 31 years from a single cutting her mother had given her the day she married Harold, and that she had brought to first prize at the Grangeville County Fair in 1978, 1981, 1984, and 1989. She said the years with the precision of a woman who understood that precision was a form of respect for the truth. She had also told him about the letters. Harold had written her letters their entire marriage, not on anniversaries or birthdays, but on ordinary Tuesdays and Saturdays, whenever something struck him as worth saying in the form of a letter rather than a conversation. He had been, she said with the mild, affectionate exasperation of long partnership, a man who could not fully think a thought until he had written it down, and this meant that she had been the recipient of 40 years of Harold Pruitt thinking clearly. She kept them in a shoebox. She had always kept them in a shoebox, because Harold had kept them in a shoebox, which was where he had put the first one the day after their wedding, in a gesture she had not understood was permanent, until he was gone, and the box was the shape of what remained of him. Nathan put his hand on the brown paper and held it there for a moment. Then he opened the box. The letters were on top, tied with kitchen twine, bundled by year in a system so orderly it could only belong to a woman who had been a farmer's wife and understood that the alternative to order was loss. 41 years of Harold Pruitt thinking clearly, addressed to Agnes, smelling of decades. Nathan did not read them. He understood instinctively, without needing to reason it out, that the letters were not for him, but with him. That Agnes had not sent him Harold's words, but Harold's presence, which was different. Which was something you could only fully understand once you had also lost the person whose presence you were still carrying. Beneath the letters was a photograph. Harold and Agnes in front of the house outside Grangeville. Summer. Harold in work clothes with his hand at the small of her back, and Agnes in a yellow dress with her face turned slightly toward him in the way people turn toward warmth without deciding to. They were both laughing at something outside the frame. The photograph had the quality of a moment that didn't know it was being preserved. Beneath the photograph was a folded piece of paper. Nathan unfolded it. It was in Agnes's handwriting, the same careful cursive from the outside of the box. It was short. It said, "Nathan, you asked me what I was proud of. I told you about the dahlias," which was true. "What I didn't tell you was this. I am proud that I kept Harold's letters when keeping them was all I had left to do. I am proud that I never pretended the years were easier than they were, and I am proud that I never let the hard ones make me mean. I want you to have the letters and the photograph because I don't want them in a county box. I want them with someone who knows what it costs to keep a thing. You know. I could see that you knew the first Friday you came. The dahlias are in the garden encyclopedia on the bottom. The cutting instructions are on page 212. Start them in February. They come up burgundy and cream." Nathan set the paper down on the table. He sat with it for a long time in the quiet of the kitchen. Ranger had shifted during the reading and was now sitting beside Nathan's chair with his shoulder pressed against Nathan's leg, not demanding anything, just present. The way he was present when the weight of a thing required a witness. The garden encyclopedia was at the bottom of the box, heavy and dog-eared, its spine cracked from a lifetime of consultation. Page 212 had a corner folded down. The cutting instructions were annotated in pencil in Agnes's hand, not the careful cursive of the letter, but the quick, practical notations of someone who knew the work and was writing for someone who would need to learn it. Feb 15 at the earliest. Cold kills them before they're ready. Be patient. Nathan read the instructions twice. He drove to Grangeville the following Saturday. The house outside town was occupied by a couple who had bought it from the county estate 3 years prior, and who listened with the guarded attention of people not sure what they were being asked for, while Nathan explained that the woman who had lived there for 60 years had left him instructions for a dahlia cutting from a plant in the south garden. The woman of the house, her name was Carol, and she had the direct manner of someone who had moved to Idaho because they meant it, looked at him for a moment, and then said, "Let me show you where the south garden is," and led him around the house to a bed that had been overgrown for 2 seasons, but was still, underneath, the organized root system of a dahlia that had been tended for 31 years, and knew its own ground. He took the cutting the way Agnes had written it. He started it in February, in a pot on the kitchen windowsill, the way the annotation said. He was patient in the way the annotation required. By April, the first leaves had come. It took 2 growing seasons to produce what Agnes would have recognized, but in the second July, in a raised bed Nathan had built along the south side of his father's house, in the particular orientation Agnes had noted in pencil, on page 212, morning sun, afternoon shade. They don't like to be watched. 2 dinner plate dahlias came up burgundy and cream. Ranger investigated them on the morning they opened, moving around the raised bed with the careful professional attention of a dog conducting a clearance, ears forward, nose working, and then sat back and looked at Nathan with the expression he brought to things he had determined were significant. Nathan stood in the July morning light with his coffee and looked at the flowers and thought about Harold's letters, which he kept in the original box in the cabinet above the refrigerator, and about a woman who had been proud of keeping a thing even when keeping was all there was left to do. He thought about what it cost to keep a thing. He understood, standing there, that he had been keeping things too. Compressed things, unspoken things, the weight of 2 deployments and a nerve injury, and the particular silence of a man living alone in his father's house, learning what peace required. He thought about how Agnes had looked at him on that first Friday and said, "I can see that you knew." And he understood now that she had been right and that she had been offering him something in the saying of it. Not sympathy, not pity, but recognition. The dignity of being seen accurately by someone who had survived enough to know the difference. The county had said she had no family. Nathan stood in front of the burgundy and cream dahlias in the July light and understood that the county had been working with incomplete information. Sometimes God does not send us the family we are born into. Sometimes He sends us the ones who ask the right question on a Friday afternoon and stay long enough to hear the answer. Agnes Pruitt had lived 87 years and outlived everyone she came into the world beside, and she had decided, in the end, that the letters and the photograph and the cutting instructions were not hers to keep anymore, but ours to carry forward. Every person who has ever held something carefully through a hard season and refused to put it down. We are surrounded by people whose boxes are full and whose names are on no visitor logs. All it takes is a Friday. All it takes is asking what someone is proud of and meaning it when you listen. There is no grief God cannot work with, and no life so quietly kept that it has nothing left to give. If Agnes's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that no one's life is ordinary from the inside. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us this: is there someone you know who is waiting for someone to ask what they are proud of? Your answer might send somebody to make a visit this Friday. If you believe in stories of service, love, and the quiet courage of people who keep their promises, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you always, the people who stayed the longest to tend something are the ones with the most left to teach.